for their servants or slaves. This was only for the visitors' servants or slaves. So if you came to visit, this is where your servants would stay. So it's pretty simple place for them to stay. The smokehouse, he would smoke about 300 hams a year. So this was to smoke. It was really important to smoke their meat because it kept it from going bad. Remember, they didn't have a way to really keep it from going bad like we do. They didn't have freezers. So this is salt that they would put on. So that's just one of those buildings. Then we have the storehouse. So this was all kinds of items. This was tools. This was all kinds of things. This is basically where they kept everything where they didn't have a place for in the house. So tools, nails, gunpowder, blankets, extra clothes, all kinds of things were kept here. At one point, George Washington's secretary also lived here, but not at this point in time, obviously. Then we have the gardener's house. So this also served as, so first this served as a hospital for slaves, then it served as a place for wool spinning, and then it served as a dwelling for William Spence, which was Washington's head gardener. So this was where he lived. So a little place. Gardener's report. All the cute little pots for plants there. And that's his bedroom. So that's where he lived. Next, we have the salt house. This was salt. So he would get salt imported from England, Portugal, Caribbean, and they would put meat and fish in here. So this, imagine having a literal house for salt. That's how much his farm did. Then we have the spinning room, where they would turn the flax and wool into thread, and they would weave that into cloth. So they had servants or slaves that would do that. Then we have the blacksmith shop. So the first reference is in 1755, and this was reconstructed after a ton of research that they did in 2009. But this had to happen because, they had to make tools, and they had to, do things even like making traps or, knives, all kinds of things. They had to make like shoes for horses. Anything you can think of that needed to be made, they could make it here in the blacksmith shop. So we're going to go to the overseer's quarters. So each of George Washington's 5 Mount Vernon farms had a manager. This was for the Mansion House farm. So each of those managers had this type of little house. So this overseer would supervise livestock, crops, and the free and slave people who worked there. So this is their little house. And like I said, there were one of those for every single farm because there were 5 farms. So then we go to the men's slave quarters. As I said, there were several slaves on this plantation. This was only for the slaves that worked on the Mansion House farm and the nearby mansion. They lived within this room. They probably worked as servants in the mansion, or as craftsmen, or as skilled laborers. So this is where they would live. So 10 to 20 enslaved men slept in this. And it includes some that they think were a valet, a blacksmith, a gardener, a carpenter. And at that point in time, most of Virginia's enslaved population lived in single or double family cabins. However, at this point, many enslaved men were either single or needed to live away from their families. based on their jobs. Next, we have the women's slave quarters. So these were also only the slaves who worked on the mansion house farm. So a lot of times they would be the ones who would do laundry, knitting, spinning wheel, servants who would work in the house. So if you can see, they're actually made from brick, and they would cover them with straw, and then they would have blankets that they would put down on top of the straw. So that is where they lived. Children would also stay here if a woman had a child. All right. So next we have the slave cabin yard. So this is a family cabin, which we're going to get to look at. So as you can see, it's pretty far away from everything else. It's not very close to anything. Now I will show you. So an enslaved person was allowed to grow crops, and they were allowed to either sell those to George Washington or to sell them at the market, or they could eat them. So they were allowed to have their own crops, but that's pretty much all they were allowed to have. I think they also have chickens. Let's look at the chicken coop. Yep, they could also sell poultry or eggs. All right. Moving on to the slave cabin. So this is where most Mount Vernon slaves lived. So if you remember, we looked at the men's and the women's. That was there basically for the people who weren't married or who had to work jobs like closer to the mansion. However, this is where most slaves live. So it's very small, very, very small. They have like a small area. And this is where they would sleep. And if we go up, I don't think we can go up. There was a loft. So that could be used for extra storage, sleeping. Imagine sleeping up there. So that was where, that was the type of living arrangement that most of the slaves lived in. So now we're going to go to a 16-sided barn. Working on it. Here we go. So he actually came up with this, and it was designed for treading wheat. So basically horses would go and they would go over all of this, and they would, you can see somewhere, he had a horse, and they would tread the wheat. They would walk on the wheat to get it all crushed down. So this was his invention. He came up with this, which was pretty cool. That's why I said he was a very inventive person, which helped him be very successful. And then we have the stable. He was known as being one of the most successful horsemen of his time, and he really liked horses a lot. So this is where he kept his horses, his tackle, his carriages, things like that. So we're going to look next at the bowling green. It's not for actual bowling. So this is beautiful. This is obviously one of the most impressive parts. So Washington did this on purpose. Originally, it was very geometric, but he wanted it to look real and very natural. So he planted a lot of these trees to try to make it look more natural. So gorgeous view. Then we have the upper garden. So here at the upper garden, he created this, or he finished it in 1776. It was a fruits and nuts garden, and it became very decorative in addition to being necessary. It has a greenhouse, which is right here, and it has lots of flowers and herbs and vegetables. So if you go there, you can walk through this garden. And we have the North Lane. So these are some of the important buildings that we were already in. So the overseer's building, the head gardener, the spinning building, the blacksmith shop, all of that is located here on the North Lane as you walk through. And then the South Lane. So this, you'll find the kitchen, storeroom, the smokehouse, the laundry, the stables. So you can see it almost looked like a little village. This is how big his farm was. It was insane. And this is only one of his 5 farms. So very, very, very large place. Then we're going to look at the lower garden. This was used as the kitchen garden. So this was actually part of it. It had like brick walls for protection, if you can see these walls to keep animals out and things like that. And it had things like pears and apples along the way. So this is pretty much where all of the food that they would eat would come from. So things like lettuce, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower. So this is where the cooks would come and gather the food. Then we have the fruit garden and nursery. So they grew everything from peaches, apples, pears, strawberries, gooseberries. And then in the actual nursery, he would grow vegetables and shrubs and grasses. So as you can see, it's not as full as it was then, but this is a very full area. Looks like those are pear trees. That's fun. We have apple trees, peach trees. So this is his little orchard area. Going to the old tomb. So this was originally the place where George Washington and Martha Washington were buried. However, in his will, Washington asked that a new tomb be built because he knew that this one was small and really beat up. So they created the new tomb. So this was the tomb that was created. In 1831, he and all of his descendants were buried here in this new tomb. There is now a slave memorial, and this was made in 1929. It was a memorial to all the slaves that were buried at the estate. It was actually the first of its kind in the nation. And then in 1983, a more substantial slave memorial was unveiled. The words love, hope, and faith are inscribed on the steps. So says in memory of the African Americans who served as slaves at Mount Vernon, this monument marking their burial ground dedicated September 21st, 1983, Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So this was the memorial for the slaves that were buried there. All right. Next, we are going to go to the wharf, which is exciting and gorgeous. So the Potomac River that was in front of Mount Vernon was really important. George Washington shipped lots of goods here and received lots of goods. He also caught lots of fish. So there were 1.3 million herring in just 1722 alone. So 1.8 million fish, the herring, plus 11,000 shad, which I know. So this was his little area. And this is the path that you can walk along, which is really neat. Next, we have the Pioneer Farm. So this was actually, he used this as a laboratory to test different farming practices. So he used more than 3,000 acres that he cultivated, and it also gives visitors now a chance to learn more about some of the field slaves. Because he, like I said, he came up with crazy ideas, really crazy ideas. So, and they were, some of them are really good ideas, but here's where he kind of would practice that rather than all over. This is kind of where he would start that process. So going to the animal pens, animals were really important. There were oxen, sheep, pigs, chickens, and that's kind of where they would get to see all of those. Some of those animals are still there. I mean, obviously not the exact animals, but some of the animals, they do still have some animals there if you go to see it. So the West Gate, this is where they would enter Mount Vernon. So way up there is the Bowling Green. So way up there is Mount Vernon. But this is the path that you would ride in. There's the gate that you would enter. Here is the necessary. That is the toilet. So this building is the toilet. They were kept outside and away from the mansion and out of public view. So here is where you would go, which is pretty fancy for this time period. So that's where that is. Now we're going to go to the distillery and the grist mill. So here's the outside view, and it's about 3 miles away from the mansion. The grist mill was where he would produce flour and cornmeal, and then he also produced alcohol. He produced whiskey. So here, very, very, very pretty area. So here's the grist mill, the first floor. So it's actually a water wheel, and you can see this is just the first floor of it. The water wheel has it's connected to large gears, which you can see here, and it helps to power the entire mill. The ground flour eventually returns here where it meets the shaker sifter. So it's pretty cool. You can just see all of the huge equipment that this was. Here we go. Here's the shaker sifter. So it kind of sifts the flour, which is pretty neat. So that's the first floor. Then on the second floor of the grist mill, this cleans the grains. So they're ground first. They're ground by 2 large grinding wheels. So you can see here, grain comes down there, and then it's ground. And that's where some of the flour is kept. That's the grain elevator. So this would actually pull the grain up and down, which is really cool. So here's another one. So they have 2 sets of grinding because they would grind corn, oats, and barley and rye, and then the other side would grind wheat, which was what he had the most of. So that's why that was all by itself. Then onto the third floor. This has 2 important systems. It had the rolling screen, which separated debris and chaff from the wheat seed, and then the bolting chest that sifted and grated milled flour. So right here is the rolling screen. So that will basically separate all the bad stuff from the good stuff. And then the bolting chest, which trying to go over to it, was right here. That would help to sift the flour. Onto the 4th floor. This is a very tall building. This is where the raw wheat is deposited and prepared for its journey. So really it goes from top to bottom, sort of. So it is then the ground flour. This is actually ground flour. It's spread out and cooled, which is really cool. So this is called the hopper boy, and they cool it off, and then this is where they collect it. So those are the gear drives that run this thing, which is so neat. Here is where the grain bins are. So before you do anything. Here's the distillery. So it's huge. It was very, very large, and you need grain for this as well, which is why it's kind of all together. So here is where that would work. Last but not least, we're going to his library. So this is, sorry, not his library. This is the library that they have now built there. This was not his actual library. So this is the gorgeous library that they've created there. It is so beautiful. They have, done, this beautiful entrance, and you can see, here we go. This is where the residential fellows live. So basically the people who take care of it, the people who study there, things like that, that's where they are. But it's gorgeous library, so beautiful. So we can go to the reading room first. So they tried to make it look like it would have looked in certain parts of it in 1785. So these were in 1785. They tried to make some of the some of the decor, you know, very fancy like that. And this is where lots of people do research and they talk. As you can see, the carpet is also, they tried to kind of bring back the older times with that. The actual library is very fancy and not at all during that time though. So this is where they do a lot of the research. The document room is where, hold on, here we go, where there's a really famous portrait of George Washington. And basically people come here and you can see these are all kept behind enclosed doors, and you can see they have keys. These are their special collections, and only researchers are allowed to look at them. These are some of George Washington's medals, which is crazy. There's so many of them. They commemorate his accomplishments. So basically, these aren't actual, well, this one is. They aren't actually, most of them aren't actually his medals, but they're medals that are used to like show the big things that happened. Some of them he actually got. Moving on to the rare books suite. So they have original books owned by George Washington, as well as duplicate editions of books from his library. This is also huge, and it is his book plate, which we'll talk about. So it's the Washington family crest and motto. He ordered 300 of them. So here are just some of his books, or copies of his books that he had. This is the Acts of Congress. Then we have the reception hall, which is pretty neat. I think this is the neatest looking one, sort of. So it actually has a stone wall carved with titles of books owned by George Washington. So I just think that that's really cool. That it just has different things like that. I think that's really neat. So lots of events are served here, which is really fancy. Events can be served all over the place. Fancy little room, or hall, I guess. Then we have the leadership hall. This is where lots of lectures and events happen. It can fit up to 100 people, and it has a huge screen, as you can see. So lots of people can sit in here. Now, obviously, 100 people aren't going to fit the way that they have it set up right now, but if it was just chairs, they could. And then the back of the library. Which is just pretty little area. So let's go back to the front to finish and go back where we started. All right, so I know that that was quite the long tour, but I hope that you enjoyed it. I know that I love getting to see this. And remember, there is so much more that you can explore if you go to this website. You just go to virtualtour.mountvernon.org, and there's so much more you can explore if you would like to, more than I had time to explore. You saw how long it went without me clicking on every single one of these little dots. But there's a lot of really neat stories that are included in this tour if you do click on a lot of those dots, so I encourage you to do that. But I hope that you enjoy getting a glimpse of what George Washington lives like and what his home was like and what was important to him. I think that when we get to see something like that, it helps us to view that person a little bit differently. So I hope that you enjoyed this tour. I loved doing it with you, and I'm looking forward to our next virtual field trip. I will talk to you next time. Bye, third grade.